Over the past few decades, there's been much discussion about the damage that greenhouse gases have had on the environment. There are a number of different ways that regions can use to address the problem and reduce the amount of man-made greenhouse gas emissions. As a large part of its strategy, the Canadian government chose to implement a consumer carbon tax. The goal of this tax was to make consumption of products that release the most greenhouse gases more expensive relative to other alternatives. The intended purpose was to change behavior so that people would consume less greenhouse gas emitting products. But how effective has the tax been? What other practices have led to decreases in greenhouse gas emissions, and what has the cost to consumers been? First, we have to consider the different ways that consumers have reduced greenhouse gas emissions.
How have consumers reduced greenhouse gas emissions? Consumers have reduced the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that they are responsible for in everyday life through a number of ways. These include installing programmable thermostats, installing more efficient furnaces and air conditioners, turning off lights that don't need to be on, and switching to light bulbs that use less energy, using more energy-efficient appliances, reducing household water use, planning trips and reducing the amount they drive, biking or walking for short trips, taking public transit where possible, recycling a number of household items, including organics. What part has the carbon tax played in GHG emission reduction? What are the reasons behind changes in consumer behavior that have led to a reduction in the average amount of greenhouse gas emissions generated by a household? These include the desire to do the right thing to make the planet a better place to live for current and future generations, education, and awareness. Individuals are far more likely to choose an environmentally friendly option if they are aware of its benefits. New options that were not available in the past. This could include everything from a small energy-efficient appliance to an energy-efficient furnace to driving an electric vehicle. Government incentives, such as rebates for installing efficient furnaces or additional insulation. New government regulations which require new homes to be built to higher environmental standards. Environmental options becoming the status quo. An example of this is recycling and putting out recycling bins, along with most other people in a neighborhood. Punitive measures, such as the consumer carbon tax, which has been implemented in Canada at the federal level since 2019. Other jurisdictions, such as British Columbia, implemented a carbon tax as early as 2008. A good question to ask is how much has the consumer carbon tax reduced household greenhouse gas emissions? Since a number of factors are in play, most importantly, the desire of each individual to reduce emissions. It is difficult to put a specific number on the effect of the carbon tax in isolation. However, we can make some assumptions. First, for most of the above cases, we know that there has to be some desire for the behavioral change to take place. Even if an individual knows that there is some environmental benefit to a specific choice, they need to believe that the benefit is great enough to make the effort and cost worth the change. These decisions can be influenced by awareness and education. Purchasing a programmable thermostat and programming it to turn down the temperature of a house at night is a relatively inexpensive option that takes very little effort. Most people will see this as a good option. However, installing solar panels is a much more expensive option that requires more effort. This is an option that has a benefit that is realized over a number of years. It is less likely to be implemented if a homeowner wants immediate overall savings. This is because it will take several years to recoup the initial investment. This timeline will be even longer if large batteries are installed to store the power generated from the solar panels, as they are also very expensive. The consumer has to see the advantage in the long run. Other emission-reducing options are out of the consumer's control. This includes replacing an appliance that has failed and is not worth fixing. If this is an old appliance, the new appliance will be much more energy efficient as long as it was manufactured in the past 20 years. If a consumer purchases a house or an apartment that was built more recently, the house will usually be more energy efficient since it was built to higher standards than in the past. Organic recycling will reduce overall household emissions, since the recycled material will no longer release large amounts of methane as they did in the past when they ended up in a landfill. Newer batteries last longer, and we have more rechargeable batteries, decreasing the number a household uses per year. Government incentives can be a powerful tool that help influence households to make a decision that will decrease their GHG emissions. An example is providing a rebate on a newly purchased efficient furnace or upgrading attic insulation in a house. This could also be a rebate on the purchase of an electric vehicle. This incentive will often be more convincing to the consumer than a tax on commodities. This is because the consumer receives a large rebate at one time in the amount of several hundred to several $1,000s, depending on the purchase.
So, how significant has the consumer carbon tax been in changing individuals' behavior to more green alternatives? As with most of the other reasons that people change their behavior, any changes based on the increased cost of a carbon tax has to be accompanied by a desire for change. The consumer has to see a benefit to either themselves or the general population, or both. Again, this is tied to education and awareness. Because of this, most of the reductions in emissions from a carbon tax would be seen in the initial years of implementation, due to increased awareness, as well as other options such as rebates that are usually implemented at the same time. This is because most of these reductions can be attributed to inexpensive and easy to implement options. Some examples include individuals turning off unneeded lights, individuals turning the heat down in their house at night or while on vacation, planning trips better so they reduce the distance they drive in a month, switching from mowing their lawns weekly to twice a month. Once the easy-to-implement and low-cost options are exhausted, the potential of low-cost affordable options is reduced. Therefore, it's increasingly difficult to achieve higher gains from a carbon tax, even when the amount of the tax is increased. The increased burden of higher carbon taxes, both direct and indirect, lead to a reduction in disposable income for the household. This makes it more difficult to save up for expensive, environmentally friendly alternatives. These can include new furnaces, new windows, and installation of solar panels. Overall, this results in a negative rather than a positive environmental effect. The true benefits of the consumer carbon tax are very difficult to measure since each individual's motivations in moving to more environmentally friendly options will be different. However, we do know that behavioral change needs to come from a desire to change, so a carbon tax alone will not drive this change. A good question to ask people is, what changes would they have still made without a carbon tax? Since so much of this behavioral change is based on desire, most of these changes would have still occurred. Both environmental and cost-saving benefits are still achieved with or without a carbon tax. The main difference is that with a carbon tax, a higher amount is initially paid for commodities, and any rebates are refunded at a later date. Unfortunately, a number of indirect costs, including administration costs and increased transportation costs, also occur as a result of the tax. After the implementation of the carbon tax, there was some motivation for behavioral change caused by the effects of increased awareness. However, after this initial period, most further change will be the result of the desire to change and availability of new environmentally friendly options. It's likely that almost all initial change towards environmentally friendly options could have been achieved with better education and awareness. This would have happened at a much lower cost to consumers. Governments have been warned for years about the cost of a consumer carbon tax. Let's watch this interview from the fall of 2016 with the then interim Conservative leader, Rona Ambrose.
But we don't think reaching those targets on the backs of ordinary working people and taxing them is the right approach. And so we tried to amend the Liberals' motion in the House to remove that carbon tax on working people. That was shot down by the NDP and the Liberals, and so in the end we voted against it.
This interview took place more than 8 years ago. I included this excerpt to show just how long ago concerns about the potential costs of a carbon tax were raised. In Canada, at the federal level, these warnings have been ignored by policymakers. Some politicians still insist that a consumer carbon tax leads to significant greenhouse gas emission reductions. Here's a clip of Mark Carney addressing a potential carbon tax replacement during his announcement to run for the leadership of the Liberal Party.
I've said for a long time that if you are going to take out the carbon tax, you should replace it with something that is at least, if not more effective. And by effective, it's not just having the same impact in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but it's making our companies more competitive, it's creating jobs, it's ensuring that Canadian households are made whole in terms of their finances. Because perception may be that it takes out more than the rebate provides, but reality is different. And Canadians will miss that money.
Mark Carney says that he will replace the carbon tax with something more effective. Does that mean an even higher carbon tax? He has mentioned in the past that Canada's carbon tax was too low. He also mentions that it's just perception that people don't get back in rebates what they pay. However, several studies, including Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer, says that when both direct and indirect costs are factored in, most people are worse off. Some studies claim that most individuals are out several $100s per year. This is at the current tax rate, which is scheduled to increase on April 1st, 2025. The Parliamentary Budget Officer has reported that the carbon tax costs more than the rebates for most Canadians. The report also states that the fuel charge lowers employment and investment income. If I interpret this correctly, Mark Carney wants to continue down a road that has proven to be ineffective and costly. Several other, more effective options without as many indirect costs are available to help consumers reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It doesn't seem to be smart to continue down the same road that has proven to not be effective. Here's another clip from CTV's Power Play with the current Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Stephen Guilbeault.
And I remember doing multiple interviews with you in which you told me that politicians who cave into pressure on the carbon tax don't care about climate change. How can you now be one of them?
I mean, what I have said, Vashi, is that the consumer component of our carbon pricing system is a good policy, and it's a policy that works. It is helping us reduce emissions. It is putting more money in people's pocket for the majority of Canadians where the federal system applies. But at the same time, I'm forced to recognize that largely due to Pierre Poilievre's campaign to frankly lie and misguide Canadians, it has become very unpopular.
Guilbeault states that the carbon tax is a success and that in some cases it even generates revenue. If this was the case, you would think the government would be boasting about this revenue generation. This seems to be in disagreement with the general consensus on the effect of the consumer carbon tax and what Canadian people want. Both Guilbeault and Carney claim that people just don't understand the way the carbon tax works. However, they never factor in the indirect costs of a carbon tax. In addition, the carbon tax costs the federal government $80 million per year to implement. Also, it appears that they attribute emission reductions produced from other green solutions, such as recycling, the use of new energy-efficient appliances, and rebates to the carbon tax. This is very similar to what we have seen for the past several years with the current government. If you want to watch the full reference videos, the links can be found in the description of this video. So looking back, we see that the consumer carbon tax has had very little overall effect in changing people's behavior to more green alternatives. Rebates, and having more options that are environmentally friendly, such as organic recycling, the churn of energy-efficient appliances and furnaces to more efficient models, have played a much bigger part in reducing greenhouse gas emissions in households in Canada. The best thing to come out of the introduction of the consumer carbon tax was the additional awareness of the importance of households becoming more environmentally friendly. However, even this was only moderately effective throughout 2019 and 2020. Since then, people have become accustomed to the tax and have adjusted to it, although reluctantly. It has become just another expense added to gasoline purchases and heating and grocery bills. It has very little effect in changing individuals' behavior. Even with carbon tax rebates, there are very significant indirect costs associated with the carbon tax. These costs far outweigh the benefits of the carbon tax, since most of the benefits are associated with increased education and awareness and having affordable alternatives. Almost none of these emission reduction gains have been the result of the carbon tax alone. Additional costs of the carbon tax to the consumers have driven up food prices, energy prices, and the price of most other products. If anything, the carbon tax has reduced the average household's disposable income, so they have less to invest in options that lower their emissions footprint, especially for moderate to high-cost solutions such as upgrading insulation or installing solar panels.